Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. This week's story was sent in by listener Jessa Maxell. She wanted me to cover the case of Joseph Palczynski. Joseph is considered a spree killer. 2 weeks ago, I talked about the terms serial killer and mass murderer. Now we're throwing the term spree killer into the mix. A spree killer is someone who has killed 2 or more people. Unlike a mass murderer who kills a number of people at once, they kill at different times and locations. But this is over a short period of time, no cool-down period like with a serial killer. Joseph Palczynski, who I'm going to call Joe, murdered 4 people in Baltimore, Maryland in March of 2000. But his criminal activity started way before the murders. Joe was born November 11, 1968, in a suburb of Baltimore. Unlike most of my stories, Joe had a really good home life. With the exception of his biological father, Joe Sr., abandoning the family when he was just 8 years old. He saw him only sporadically through his life. Joe's stepfather is the one who raised him. His parents loved and cared for him. No abuse, no drug use, or alcoholism. But Joe's issues didn't have to do with his upbringing. He was in an accident as a teenager. He was standing up on the school bus when it collided with another bus in the parking lot. Because Joe was standing when it happened, the impact threw him against the window of the bus and then slammed him onto the ground. He was never the same following this incident. A few weeks later, Joe's parents said he was just standing in the kitchen, normal, like any other day. Then all of a sudden, he was on the floor, rolling around and screaming. His parents thought that he had injured himself in some way and ran over to help. Joe began thrashing around and scratching his mom and stepdad when they tried to contain him. They had no idea what was going on or what to do, so they called 911. He had to be strapped down to keep him from attacking the EMS. He was immediately taken to the closest hospital for treatment. He was diagnosed with having a post-traumatic psychotic episode. Following the head injury, Joe was a challenge to keep controlled. Doctors tried different medications that were supposed to treat bipolar disorder. Unfortunately, these treatments did not show improvement in Joe's behavior. He continued to lash out through his teenage years, and it seemed like medical professionals basically gave up on him. His parents sued the Baltimore school system over the bus accident, but the case was dismissed. His aggressive behavior mainly stemmed from his head injury, but he also harbored anger from the unexpected death of his sister. He was 17 years old when she died in a car accident. Joe spent a lot of time at the gym. This was his own personal therapy. Exercise is proven to reduce anxiety, depression, and negative mood by improving self-esteem and cognitive function. He was really into karate, lifting weights, and bodybuilding. His new look boosted his confidence level into what I would call arrogance. He was described as being well-liked. He had a lot of friends and girlfriends. Unfortunately, the women tended to be the ones who experienced his violent side. The ladies lined up to be with Joe, but each one became a victim of his violence and domestic abuse. Over the years, Joe had 7 separate domestic violence charges against him. It began the summer after high school graduation. Joe punched a 16-year-old girl after she refused to have sex with him. If that wasn't enough, he threatened her with a razor blade. He had to seek proper counseling and was put on probation for 2 years. He wasn't compliant with the rules that came along with the probation, and a judge revoked the sentencing, having him serve 4 years in prison. He only served 2 of the 4, getting released early for good behavior. But don't be fooled, Joe was nowhere near reformed. Upon his release, he started dating another high school girl. She filed charges against him after he slammed her into a wall and told her he was going to, quote, blow her brains out. Joe was arrested, and if his bail was to be paid, he would be allowed to go home under one condition. He was not to contact the girl he threatened. He agreed, but immediately after release, he dialed her phone over and over. He called 15 times and told her if she testified against him, he would kill her. Violating the terms that were agreed upon at his bail hearing, Joe was taken back into custody. He went to a hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. After 3 days at the hospital, Joe turned into the Hulk and literally busted through a door of the building and took off running. It sounds crazy, but he was able to get away. He ran for the woods and didn't stop. Joe somehow ended up in Idaho, pretty far away from Maryland. 2 months later, his new girlfriend, another 16-year-old, called the police to report the sexual/domestic assault she just endured from her boyfriend. When police arrived on the scene, Joe had locked himself inside of her apartment. He had a gun. The situation escalated when he refused to surrender. Federal marshals and the SWAT team were called in. It took them 16 hours to get Joe out of the apartment safely. He was extradited back to Maryland and spent 2 years in 3 different mental institutions. By the end of the 2-year stay, psychologist Dr. Conroy said, quote, "It appears that he has fully recovered. Joseph Palczynski is not currently suffering from any mental disease or defect, which would render him a substantial risk of bodily injury to another person or serious damage to the property of another if released." Unquote. He was released but had to serve 5 years probation. Just 7 months after he was supposedly cured of his mental illness, Joe assaulted another girlfriend, Michelle Osborne. She was 4 months pregnant with their baby. Joe became furious when Michelle lit a cigarette. "I understand the anger there. You definitely should not smoke while pregnant. In case you've never read the Surgeon General's warning on the side of the carton, smoking by pregnant women may result in fetal injury, premature birth, and low birth weight." Michelle went to work, but he was waiting for her in the parking lot when her shift was over. He threw her into the car, screamed, kicked, and pulled her hair. He drove them back to his apartment where the physical abuse continued. Michelle must have been able to get out an SOS message to her friends. 2 of them came rushing over to Joe's apartment and were able to get him under control. But he wasn't done with Michelle. 2 days later, he did the same thing. He forced her into his car and took her back to his apartment, where he picked up where he left off, beating her. The assaults on Michelle ended up causing her to have a miscarriage. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but Dr. Michael Spodak stated he was fit to stand trial. This altercation was a violation of his parole. Between the parole he was already serving and the new assault charges, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Not long after his release, Joe's stepfather committed suicide. Joe was the one who found him, adding to his post-traumatic stress. March 4th, 2000, Joe was arrested for domestic abuse against his current girlfriend, 22-year-old Tracy Whitehead. Even though this is an obvious pattern for Joe, bail was set for his release, $7,500, which someone paid, probably his mother. Tracy was leaving him. She had enough of his abuse. Afraid of what he might do next, she stayed at her neighbor's house until she was able to move in with her mother. Her neighbors, George and Gloria Schenk, were happy to give her a safe place to stay. March 7th, 31-year-old Joe completely snapped. The day prior, a friend helped him obtain a rifle and a shotgun. He showed up at her apartment looking for her. Furious that she wasn't home, he began pounding on the door of her surrounding neighbors. Joe broke into the Schenk home, where he then shot and killed George and Gloria. He grabbed Tracy and pulled her alongside him outside to his mother's car. Another neighbor, David Myers, came outside to try and help protect Tracy. He shot David and drove off. Police knew that Joe Palczynski was responsible for the triple homicide in the apartment complex. Barricades were placed in surrounding areas to try and trap him. Twice he was able to drive right through them and get away. The public was alerted of Joe's crimes and the fact that he was armed and considered very dangerous. His mother went on TV and pleaded for her son to turn himself in. Aware that he was part of a citywide manhunt, Joe attempted to ditch his mother's car and steal a new one. His first try at carjacking was unsuccessful. 36-year-old Jennifer Mcdonald stood in his way. She was shot and killed in front of her family. Joe was able to flee the scene. The worst part is that Jennifer was pregnant. A nearby 2-year-old child was grazed by a bullet, but luckily had a full recovery. He ended up stealing a car from an 81-year-old woman who was not physically harmed in any way, thank God. In their new ride, Joe drove to the El Rich Motel so he could try to get some sleep. They had been on the run for days. The motel worker didn't recognize Joe or Tracy when he checked them in that night. Joe used the alias John Silver. Once into the room number 25, Joe turned on the local news. He wanted an update on his last known whereabouts to try to stay a step ahead of the police. While watching his face flash across the screen, Joe realized he left his guns in the car. He didn't trust leaving Tracy alone, so he made her come along while he walked back out to the car. As they stepped outside, Tracy spotted a police car in the parking lot. She took off running towards it as fast as she could. Joe had an oh shit moment and ran in the opposite direction towards the woods. Tracy Whitehead was finally safe from her kidnapper, but Joe, you guessed it, was able to evade the police. I don't know how this man is able to run on foot and avoid being caught over and over. He made his way to the Essex community of Baltimore. While walking, he came across a young boy playing outside, and Joe persuaded the boy to let him in the house. Once inside, he tied up the entire family. For hours, they wondered if they were going to die. But this was more of a game to Joe. When he finished terrorizing them, he stole their guns and let them free. He made his way to Virginia. Joe claims he paid someone to drive him there, but investigators think he traveled by train. He kidnapped a man named William Terrell. He parked at a shopping center and handed William cash. He told him if he didn't do exactly what he asked, he would start shooting anyone and everyone around. He asked him to purchase a battery-operated TV from Best Buy, as well as food and survival equipment from the local Target. William wasn't going to be responsible for others dying. He did what Joe asked. After he got what he needed, Joe let him go. Sounds like Joe's going into hiding. Food, survival equipment. He has evaded the police this long, it would be too easy to make a spot in the woods of Virginia and hide out. But no. He had his eye on the prize, Tracy Whitehead. She is the whole reason he started this rampage. She got away, and he wanted her back. I wasn't able to find out how he made it back to Maryland. If he stole a car, hitched a ride, or used public transportation without being recognized. But for the third time, Joe crossed the barriers that were put in place to catch him. He knew that Tracy's initial plan was to move in with her mother, Lynn. He showed up at Lynn's townhouse in the East Point area of Baltimore and began pounding on the front door. When Lynn and her boyfriend, Andy McCord, realized it was Joe at the door, they panicked. It wasn't just them at home, it was also their 12-year-old son, Bradley. They knew Joe was armed and had no problem killing those who stood in his way. Lynn and Andy pushed a large dresser in front of the door to try to keep Joe from entering. He was most definitely armed, multiple guns and 200 rounds of ammo. He shot the deadbolt on the door and forced his way inside past the dresser while firing his weapons. Just then, Lynn's 7-year-old son was returning home from his dad's house. They heard gunshots fired and laid low outside. Lynn and Bradley hid while Andy ran into the other room to call 911. Joe found them and pulled Lynn out from behind the door, demanding to know where Tracy was. Police surrounded the home within minutes of Joe entering. I'm not sure who called who, but Joe got on the phone with police. He was holding Lynn, Andy, and Bradley hostage until they brought Tracy to him. He said if they didn't bring Tracy, he was going to kill them all. When Tracy never came, Joe was like, all right, fine. Put her on the phone then. He was not backing down until he saw or spoke to her. Police stood their ground, denying him the chance to talk to her. I shit you not, this standoff went on for 97 hours. That is 4 freaking days. Police invaded the neighbor's home across the street, and snipers were set up in the upstairs bedroom, aiming down towards Lynn's row house, waiting. The surrounding block was roped off, designating the space as a kill zone. Any neighbors who lived within the kill zone were forced to stay in the elementary school as a temporary shelter. After 4 days of pointless negotiations, Lynn and Andy decided it was time to try and make an escape. They crushed up Xanax into a glass of Joe's iced tea. This knocked him out, and it was their chance to make a run for it. Here's the part I do not understand, at all. 12-year-old Bradley was sleeping on the kitchen floor. Lynn and Andy escaped out of the window from the first floor, leaving Bradley with a psychotic murderer sleeping on the couch with a gun in his hand. I guess they thought if they tried to wake him, he would make noise, hoping once police saw them exit, they would go inside and rescue Bradley. I cannot fathom leaving my child behind. I would have stayed with him and allowed Andy to escape and get help, or gently wake him and whisper the plan and escape together, or dial the police from another room and let them know that Joe was asleep and off guard. I know it's not really fair of me to judge. I wasn't in the situation. I don't feel the fear or adrenaline pumping. You don't really know how you would react. But I can say one thing for sure. I'm not abandoning my kid with someone as dangerous as Joe Palczynski. When Lynn and Andy reached the police outside and explained the situation, they were like, "You did what?" I'm glad I'm not the only one that thinks that's crazy. They immediately broke down the door in an attempt to save Bradley. Joe was awake, reaching for his pile of weapons. Multiple officers fired at him, and he fell to the ground. Joe was pronounced dead at the scene. Autopsy showed that he was shot 27 times. The public felt like that was overkill, but this is very different from the controversial shootings in the media lately. This was a man who in the past 10 days had been running from police, murdered 4 people, kidnapped 2, and held 2 entire families hostage, all while packing heat. A 12-year-old boy's life was in danger, and Joe was reaching for his gun. I think firing was completely justified. It's not like one cop shot him 27 times. It was multiple officers. Lynn's boyfriend, Andy McCord, attempted to collect a $10,000 reward for the apprehension of Joseph Palczynski. He was like, well, I was the first person to call 911, but it wasn't emergency services who was offering the reward. Metro Crime Stoppers tip line was the number to dial if he wanted the 10 grand. I think you made the right phone call, Andy. It was definitely an emergency. A murderer busting into your home is not a tip line kind of situation. Then, Lynn and Andy filed a lawsuit against the Baltimore police stating that they failed to keep them safe and protected. But it turns out that they were offered protection. An officer to stay in their home with them, a round-the-clock car posted out front, and a neighborhood patrol car, all of which they declined. So obviously the lawsuit was dropped. I understand that people feel the need to be compensated for such events, but I think this comes off a bit greedy. 48-year-old Constance Ann Wogg was charged with supplying Joe with illegal weapons. He gave her the money to purchase guns for him the day before he started his rampage. She spent 16 months in prison and was forced to pay the victims' families $450,000. Serves her right. What the hell are you doing buying weapons for a mentally unstable man? Nothing good can come from it. Thanks again to Jessa for the story suggestion. This case was insane and it was new to me. I love researching cases I've never heard of. If you have a hometown case you want me to cover, send me an email to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on social media to keep the conversation going about the case. Tell me your thoughts. I love chatting with my listeners. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. You can support the show by clicking my link tree in the show notes. There you can buy Killer Stories merchandise and donate via buymeacoffee.com. Shout out to Dar for the recent donation. She said she just binged all of my episodes. It still blows my mind that people think I'm binge-worthy. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.